I'm Ranjan Panda. I teach philosophy. I come from the department called Humanities and Social Sciences. Um, Philosophy that I have been studying so far is and trying to communicate it to people in the class is mostly um, dealt with two important concepts. One is about human existence, and other is about the values. I think some of the courses which I have structured in the department, like philosophy of education, making of a man, and introduction to philosophy of mind, and in when a PG course has been introduced recently, I have been teaching history of philosophy, and also has an elective PG course called Mind, Language, and World. So in all these courses, what I have noticed is that the course is centered around this basic idea about what are we as individuals, and how can we make our life better by inculcating this idea of thinking. So thinking has been a very important concept for me, because most of us in the classroom, as Professor Jha was pointing out, this people don't really think. They if you give a reading material to them, they read or they discuss among themselves, and they can reproduce it, but hardly you get students. I think if you are teaching a class of say 60 in an elective, then you have at least 20 students who are very seriously engaged. Now they can not only write well the ideas, sometimes better than the way it is taught, and they also delve into the concepts that are used seriously. So I think uh, that is the case. That is my experience. But what is more challenging is for a non-technical subject like us is how to communicate the ideas to a student who come from say Hindi medium background, or who has not been exposed to humanities disciplines. I think that's more challenging, because you ask somebody who is say Tagore, people will hardly know anything about Gitanjali, or know what Tagore actually stands for. So I think that is where we are lacking. So most of they may be brilliant in science and technology, but they have a very little exposure to literature. They have a very little exposure to philosophical thoughts. So our duty is basically, I mean, the kind of responsibility as a teacher is basically to communicate lucidly certain important concepts, and I think that and allow them to think through those concepts.
So how do you take this? How do you solve this? Address this challenge of taking a very abstract concept like a philosophy compared to science, which is very structured or semi-structured in nature.
Philosophy is also very structured.
Huh?
Philosophy is also quite structured. I know.
Yes, I agree with that. It's structured at the higher level, but let's say I'm an undergraduate or just a postgraduate student coming and you're asking me questions about, say, as an example, give the example, Tagore's philosophy. So that might be very abstract to me at that point of time. So how do you take this transition?
I'll tell you one of the experiments in the class. So, this is a class on philosophy of education where uh, I also teach Tagore. Um, so, I found initially what is important is that you must know your class. Who are the class? You must know who are Bengali speaking or who are Telugu speaking student, what kind of cultural background they are from. You must know first when you enter to the class. You must ask and know about this student, where they are coming from, no certain background. I think that is more important, and that is when you can really inculcate empathy, and you can inculcate this whole idea of learning, because you are not just going there to teach, you are also going there to learn something. So what I did in that class is that I asked these more students to read some poems in the class, okay, and try to philosophize some of the basic concepts, like, say for example, if you are talking about freedom, a concept of freedom, or talking about humanism in Tagore, and you have to select certain poems, or tell them in advance that these are the poems, you come, bring them to the class and see how that can be discussed. So I think that's more.
Yeah. No, so there are two very interesting things. Like when we who teach things related to science, engineering, suppose I am going to teach Butler Volmer kinetics. All I am bothered about, or the two type of students I will have in my class are somebody who pays attention, somebody who does not pay attention. But when somebody teaches philosophy, as I heard, one has to also look at the background of the students. So there are a lot more types of students that are available. So that's very interesting and quite challenging, right? Compared to like teaching science or engineering. So that was one point. Second, so Shishi raised a very important or mentioned a very interesting idea that philosophy is also very structured. So when we think of philosophy, we think that it is quite abstract. That's our idea of philosophy. So, like, can we know from you how philosophy is structured?
Ranjan, become better.
Yeah.
That's very interesting question actually. Can we think anything which is unstructured? See, when you do science and technology, anything that you theorize, the very possibility of theorizing something requires a systematic thinking, is not it? So you cannot defy logic and go on, doing science, or proving a theorem, or deriving, make a derivation. Can we? We cannot. So I think the very foundation of science and technology, or philosophy in general, at a higher level, I think all these sciences that we learn, or technology that we are learning, they're quite philosophical. Okay, when we deal with them through concepts, and they're basically concepts. So therefore, when we conceptualize an idea and try to deliver it in the form of a thought, it has to be, systematically represented, and that systematic representation ought to be logical. It cannot be otherwise.
One other way of responding, for instance, is that in the classroom, I found, so I don't teach it now, but in School of Management, I taught a course for research methods. So classes on philosophy of science for a mixed background of students, right? People who come from science engineering background or social science. That were really, for me and for students, the most interesting. Because you're complicating, ways of thinking that you expected. This is an approach to doing research, a social science approach, or perhaps science quote unquote approach. Right? But when you begin to examine philosophy of science, and I don't know how many departments do that, but so it's very interesting that just it doesn't quite get to the central part what he's saying, but students relate to that abstraction if you can perhaps provoke them in some interesting ways. And it opens up a very interesting set of discussions and conversations.
Yeah, I just have one question for you.
Yeah.
Because it's important, it's relevant to practically everyone. Because you started with the word thinking, and if you just give a paper to the student and you want some response from them, how do you discern whether they have actually put enough thought before responding, or you have a way or technique to instill in them to think and then come up with something more concrete about the paper?
Yeah, I think I need to say something which Sisi pointed out in response to that. When I say it is all conceptual, and that is how one can build a logical structure. Uh, Say, for example, when you teach science, you don't really teach about causality. Don't do you? We don't. You accept that that is understood. You don't teach anything about observation, or you don't teach anything about experiment. But all the day and night people are experimenting there in your laboratory, is not it? So, or measurement, you know. So I think when we do philosophy, philosophy becomes a kind of an armchair activity, as often people say, is because philosophers find that these concepts are very important um, for the growth of knowledge. I think that's one of the things. Other thing is that in some of my classes, I do give. Um, I have a reading class. Say, for example, the slot that we get, it actually quite fit. People don't read at home. People read during exam time. But if you utilize a class for reading, 1 hour reading in the class, you give a paper and you tell them to read. Okay, and you have to decide. There are two things. You can you can say that if there is one paper, you can say that you read only this paragraph. The other group will read the another paragraph. You can divide. It depends on what kind of paper you are giving. But if it is simple paper and everyone gets an opportunity to read, because you have to upload them online, they take time and they come prepared reading. Or if they have not read, you ask them to read for, let us say, 40 minutes or 1 hour there in the class. You can utilize another half for discussion. And when you get the response, you definitely know whether they really have understood the concepts or not. So that is how.
So that means you need to understand the paper first, right?
Obviously, if you are not reading the paper yourself, then if you give to others, that is not wise.
Right.